from the book of Ephesians, the 5th chapter, beginning in the 15th verse. Thus saith the Lord, See then that you walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise, redeeming the time, because the days are evil. Therefore, do not be unwise, but understand what the will of the Lord is. This is a passage of Scripture I'm sure you've heard preached many times and are familiar with, but that doesn't mean it's any less valuable to us today. And I like to look through there and find a word here or there that is of particular interest to me. And just now, that word is redeeming or redeem. And because that's not a word we use that often anymore. I've told you before, we used that a lot when I was a kid because of S&H green stamps. You know, wherever you bought gas and groceries and stuff like that, most of them gave out S&H green stamps. And of course, you had to go to the Redemption Center, you know. And then when you'd look through that catalog, it would say, here's here's three, a plate. And it was, redeem 35 stamps for a plate. And then it would be something like a transistor radio, and it would say redeem 10,000 stamps for the transistor radio. You know, that's the way that worked. But boy, I remember getting those things and and sticking them in the book and doing all that. They kept you busy, working on that sort of thing, huh? I can still taste them. Yeah, and that really special postage stamp glue. Yeah, it's good stuff. But that's one of the few times I've ever remember, seeing that word used with any regularity. And here Paul, of course, from the King's English, back when we used to have a little more sophisticated vocabulary, Paul says, "See then that you walk circumspectly." So there he throws a word in we're not used to. And then we are to use this circumspect method of moving through life in order that we might redeem the time, because the days or the times that we live in are evil. And I want to look at first circumspect. When we talk about what it means to be circumspect, circumspect is the idea that you walk 360 degrees around a problem. Now, all of us in here have had something go wrong in the refrigerator or with your car or with the lawnmower or whatever. But you have something go wrong and you automatically assume it's one thing. And then you go, because every time this happens, every time the blender makes that noise, it means the beaters aren't, all the way engaged. Or, every time the lawnmower does this, I have to change the belt. And we all know that we've made mistakes because of that, because we're jumping to a conclusion. Here, Paul tells his audience, the church at Ephesus, he says, you should walk circumspectly. In other words, when we come up to the problem, when we see the problem, and folks, there are all kinds of problems in our world today. But when we see the problem, we need to walk all the way around it. And we have this in every area of life right now. Amy's, teaching school. And, just from the conversations that we have about it, it doesn't sound like kids are the same as they used to be. It would be easy to jump to a conclusion as to why that is. But, this is something that's too important for that. We need to walk all the way around, all the way around that problem. And I remember when I was a kid, we knew a logger, and he was his name was Stony Birch. What a name for a logger, right? It was just perfect. But Stony Birch, he would come over. Man, he was a big guy, and he was he'd been logging his entire life, and he went back into our woods, and and he cut out a bunch of ash trees for us that were they were just really too close together to be able to any of them to flourish. So he went in to cut them out. And of course, at that point, what Stoney was doing was he was cutting out the trees we wanted cut out. And his plan was to cut out the trees that we wanted without breaking the limbs off of and tearing up other trees. And I used to go out every morning after I get my chores done. I would run out and I would go on to the ridge on about 1,000 feet or so off the road on our home place where I lived. And I would go sit back there and I'd watch the squirrels and occasionally the deer and stuff like that until I saw or heard the school bus coming up the road on 191. When I heard the bus coming up there, then I'd take off running, and I'd usually make it to the end of the driveway right about the same time the bus came pulling down the road. And I went back and sat on that ridge and I watched Stoney, and he would go through and he would, in the morning, he would walk the area and he would mark trees. This is the tree I'm going to take out today, and he would mark it where he wanted to cut it, and he'd do it. And every time he walked up to one of those trees, whether it was that big around or that big around, he would walk all the way around it looking up. You know why? You can't see enough just looking at that tree from one angle. I mean, it may look straight as a die this way, but it could be curving right toward you. So if you want to know what it's going to take to drop that tree, you had to walk all the way around it. Well, we've got issues in our world today. I've already talked about school. There's child rearing, there's retirement, there's elections, there's world issues, and all sorts of issues that are going on right now in our culture. And we need to take the time to walk circumspectly around those problems, walk all the way around it so that we can understand it and we can understand how to help, which is our job. So we get by circumspect, and it says not as fools, but as wise. Well, there again, if you called me and you said, "Preacher, I've got a tree at my house I need you to cut down. How would you like me just to walk up with the saw and start cutting?" Well, that's not what we want, right? You want us to walk around all of these problems. A fool would walk up and just cut the tree down, but a wise person takes a good look at everything. And then he talks about this idea of redemption. So I went back and I looked in some of the older, more reliable, less woke dictionaries. And I tried to find what the actual word redeem meant. And as I went through it, I'm thinking none of those things make any sense to the only application that I have of redeeming as a general purpose in my life, which is a stamp or a coupon. First one is to repurchase. To repurchase. When we talk about redemption in the Bible, when we see that word redemption, it's usually talking about our salvation. And we understand that, right? God created us, that means He owns us. Well, if you own something, then you've paid for it. And God did pay for us. God created us. He created us and He made us majestic, a step below Him Himself. And as much as we were made in His image, we look the part, we act the part of a child made in the image of God. What then does He owe us? I mean, what would He owe us at that point? If I went to Rod and I said, "Rod, I'd like to buy a beef," and I bought a beef from him, and of course, Victoria, if I bought a beef from Rod, I would take it to some place where it could live in a nice pasture and be with all of its cow friends. But if something horrible were to happen and that cow were to die of natural causes, and I was to then take that beef and take it to a processor and have it processed, Well, would it make sense for me to then pay Rod every time I had a hamburger? Would it make sense for me to say, well, Rod, I've already paid you for this beef, but I'm having a beef roast today, so I figured I owed you a few bucks. It doesn't make sense. Why would you buy it again? Why would you pay all over again? And why would God, who gave us this earth and created us in His own image, why would He pay for us again with the blood of His only Son? The word redemption itself to us as Christians implies that something magnificent, that something beyond reason, that something very good and kind toward us, beyond anything we deserve, has been done on our behalf. We understand that one. Another one would be to get or win back, which is along the same lines, right? Things weren't going well this year with my garden, but I redoubled my efforts and I was able to redeem at least the beans and the squash. Right? We understand that sort of a concept. The next would be to retrieve something you own, generally by force, or even against the will of who owns it now. And there again, we understand that perfectly, don't we? Because that's what God did for us. God took us back from the hand of Satan. God made us. Satan claimed us, and God took us back. That's redemption. But then there's another kind of redemption, and that's what I believe, or at least I see to some extent, that Paul is saying here. And that's the fourth definition I have for redemption, which is to exchange something of nominal value for something of real value. It took 10,000 S&H green stamps to get the transistor radio. But you know what? At some point in time, you begin to realize, what are those stamps worth? Nothing. If you clip a coupon, I don't even know if they do this anymore, actually, but if you were to find a newspaper somewhere and clip a coupon out of it and take it to the store, a lot of times they'll give you 50 cents, $1, maybe buy one, get one for having the coupon. But if you look on the back of the coupon, it tells you what the value of that coupon is. And most of the time it's something like 1/200,000th of 1 cent. They have no real value. The only value that they have is when you exchange it for something of value. I believe to a large extent that's what Paul's asking us to do here. There are a lot of things that you have to do in your life, folks. You've got to earn a living. There are lots of things that we have to do. But what Paul, I believe, is saying to his audience here is to get something of great value for your time that most likely you're going to spend anyway. Redeem the time. What is our time worth? I don't know if that's easy to define today, because everything's a big turmoil right now in the sports world because of the WNBA and things that are going on there. And then you also think about the NBA. Now, an NBA player may make, Jeffrey, what are the high dollar NBA players making now? Is it $60 million a year? $60 million a year, yeah. Now, when was the last time you found yourself in a real problem? Maybe with an ill loved one, maybe with trouble at home with your family, maybe in financial straits, and you said, if I could just make a three-pointer, if I just had a mid-range jumper. Never, right? That's totally worthless. But if you happen to have those skills and you're an NBA player, you can redeem them. You can redeem something of little or no value to something of great value. And of course, that's the $60 million. A few of us went over to the Mecum auto auction this weekend, and I'm sitting there, and there's so much, so many people are so serious there. It's amazing. Well, don't get me wrong. There are people who are not serious at all, just there to have a good time, like us. But there were people that were very serious about this. And I'm looking at this, and it just occurred to me, there's no one here to get something they need. Nobody. There's nobody that woke up yesterday morning and said, I need a 68 Camaro. We saw probably 750 Corvettes go across the block. It was mind-bending. Nobody ever woke up and said, today I need a Corvette. You don't need that. Nobody needs any of that stuff. But we've placed value on it. And when we first started off with automobiles and the horseless carriage, it made perfect sense that we needed them. You couldn't keep a horse everywhere, and everywhere you could keep a horse, it made a mess. So it made sense to start going this way. And I'm going to say there were cars for probably 2 or 3 days before one person looked at another and said, I'll bet you my Stanley Steamer is faster than your horseless carriage. And then what happened? An entire industry and culture built around things you don't need. I kind of imagine it, and I expect it probably started with 2 women, because most of the problems in society do. So I expect it was a couple of women that started this off, and I could see it, and I kind of imagine, like some, early 1900 sheets, and of course, I could see, a couple of ladies, maybe, and they pull up in their Stanley Steamer, and maybe somebody like Paige gets out with her big, early 1900s hat on, and Sharon gets off of her horseless carriage with a parasol. And, Mrs. Copley, where are you going today? Oh, I'm just going grocery shopping. Oh, me too. I'll bet I can get there before you can. And then the trouble begins. And Sharon looks at Paige and says, well, Paige, you can take that Stanley Steamer as fast as it'll go, and it won't even blow that ridiculous hat off your head. And Paige would go, Sharon, I'm glad you have a parasol for your walk home. And this is how the problems in our society start, and they always do. And an entire industry of things that just really don't matter began. Why do they matter? Because we placed value on them, and no other reason. What about your time? What are the things involving your time that really matter? Now think about what you're going to do today. We're going to go home and we're going to have dinner as a family, and that's going to be great. We have to eat, obviously. I kind of took inventory on the whole family this morning, and I decided that none of us looks like we're very near starvation. So do we need to eat? Well, we need to eat. And we do need to spend the time together as a family. That's important. And then what? Somebody is going to say, I need a nap. And then a nap will be taken, but do you need it? And then you're going to watch a little bit of television, maybe stupid basketball. And then you're going to spend a little time doing this, and you're going to spend a little time doing that. But folks, there are things that we really need to spend time on. We all have people in our lives, we all have people in our families that need to hear the gospel. The first time, or one of the first times I ever preached, my mom looked at me and said, son, redeem the time. I didn't even really know what she meant. I was like, I didn't even know what she meant. And it took me some time to figure that out. And it took me some talking to her to figure it out. And I come to understand that what redeem the time meant, ultimately to me, is to get something of value for that which I would spend, and most usually do, for nothing. What are you getting for your time? What are you getting for your time? You're going to spend time at work tomorrow. You're going to have break time. You're going to have lunch time. You're going to have quitting time. You're going to have clock in time. And you know, all of those times of the day, what happens? You know, the old men get to the time clock first in the morning, and they stand there for 5 minutes and grump about how it's going to be a horrible day, and they didn't want to come to work this morning, and they got out of the bed and everything hurt. And then at the end of the day, the young men are standing there early to the time clock because they can't wait to get home. Why? Well, because I've got softball or this or that or the other thing, and I just can't wait to get home, and they stand there and waste their time. On your break time, on your lunch time, what are you going to do? How could you take that time, which is otherwise, can we be honest enough to say to each other, which is otherwise wasted, and get something for that time? Maybe there's somebody at work that you need to just say, hey, I'd like to invite you to church. Well, you invited me to church yesterday. Yeah, and I'll invite you tomorrow. But I've got this time, and I want to get something for it. I want something of value for this time. I would like to take this skill that I have, or this resource rather, that I have, which otherwise would be squandered. Think about it, folks. If we didn't have the NBA, can you imagine how tall some people would be who were doing absolutely nothing? We just have enormously tall people sitting on park benches. If we didn't have these kinds of things to get something for time that we would otherwise waste, what would we do? Would you stare at an empty wall? What would you do with that time? Maybe your me time isn't as important as you think. And maybe your me time needs to be spent developing and needs to be spent making something special out of the eternity that everyone around you is going to face. As we drove yesterday all the way across, halfway across Indiana, halfway across Ohio, I saw ball fields that were brimming with activity. We went to eat, and every time we stopped for gas, which Don brought home a 72 Javelin, you stop for gas a lot. Every time we stopped, there were kids there in baseball uniforms. I don't know if you noticed that or not, Dave. Kids there in baseball uniforms. Girls, I saw girls in volleyball uniforms. I'm not saying these are bad things, folks. But look at everything that we stuff into the lives of our children. And we're worried about making Tommy a great hitter. And we're worried about making Susie a great setter. How often do you think about that child's eternity? Because they may or may not grow up to play high school basketball or high school baseball. But I guarantee you one thing, they're all going to face eternity. Will we squander tens of thousands of hours to make them good ball players and never, with thought, circumspectly consider where they're going to spend eternity? Can we do that? Can we do that? Can you meet together with your friends and bowl, or meet together with your friends and play golf, or go to car shows without ever considering the fact that every one of those people is consigned to eternity? Now, where will that eternity be spent? Walk circumspectly, go all the way around the problem, and then get something for that which you will typically and most often do waste. Get something for it. Get something for that time. Look at our money today. It's a fiat currency. It doesn't even exist. It has no value. But you work hard to get a bunch of it so that you can pay a bunch of it for just a little bit of groceries. How hard do we work for something that really, truly matters? And then something in verse 17 that I want to leave you with today. Paul says, therefore, do not be unwise, but understand what the will of the Lord is. How often do we say things like, oh, the will of God's unsearchable for me. Oh, it's impossible to know the will of God. Paul seems to suggest to his audience here that they can understand what the will of the Lord is. Now, I'm not going to suggest for a moment that you can understand the ways of the Lord. That's hard, but don't we understand perfectly the will of the Lord? Why, God reached out to men over millennia, undeserving men. He reached out to them and tried to make every way possible for them to escape the doom they deserved. And then, when he had exhausted every effort and man had literally spit in his eye for the trouble, then God gave his only Son. I'm going to tell you today, I can tell you this with certainty, and this involves you, your spouse, your children, your friends, your family, your loved ones, the person sitting next to you in the pew. It is the perfect and ultimate will of God that you be redeemed unto Him and united with Him for eternity. I can know and tell you today that very thing. It is God's will that all come to repentance. It is God's will that we all be saved. It is God's will that your children be united to Him. And folks, that ain't easy. It ain't easy. There are things that are required of us here today. You know what's going to happen someday? All of us are going to look back upon our lives. And you're going to see things that worked and things that didn't. You're going to see things that worked out properly and things that didn't. But what I want you to be able to avoid is the very notion that I could have used my time better for the kingdom of God, for my family, for my friends. But I didn't. Actually, I was working and was wasting my time. Oh, I was trying to be better or do more. But in reality, because the one or the ones that mean so much to me have been lost, I wasted my time. I wasted my time. Folks, that's a hard thing to think about. But I want to invite you to do it. I want you to invite you to do it now and to do it in an environment where it can be constructive and helpful for you. I want you to think for a moment of the people who are around you and what are you doing? You know God's will. You know God's will. You already do. This isn't something that I have to tell you. You can search it and you can know the will of God as it relates to the people around you. You already know this. Now you do. What are you doing to perform and to recognize the will of God for the people around you? There isn't a thing in the world wrong with becoming a great basketball player. Don't get me wrong. I don't like basketball. I don't like basketball. I don't like soccer. I like baseball and I like bowling. But anything else is kind of suspect. But still and yet, there's nothing wrong with it. You know, if you want to make your kid the greatest soccer ball kicker, whatever that amounts to, if you want to do that, then fine. If you know, that's great. If you want to make your kid the best home run hitter ever, that's fine. That's fine. But you need to sit down, walk all the way around it, and ask yourself, am I going to end up with a genius who has no regard for God? And if so, it's time to back up. It's time to back up. Are you going to raise the happiest children in the world with no regard for God? If so, it's time to back up. Are you going to raise children that are comfortable and accepted, but have no regard for God? If so, my friend, it's time to back up. Because we know the will of God. I know I've told you all this before, but I find it funny, and it happens at least once a year. Somebody will come up to me after I have a good game of bowling, and they'll go, "Hey, good game tonight. God must really be on your side tonight, preacher." And I always tell them the same thing. I don't think God cares. I don't think he's, I don't think, I just can't see God in heaven pulling the string for me. That doesn't make sense. Because that's not what God is about. I think God, like all fathers do with their kids, I think he loves to see us excel. But his concern is not my bowling average. Exactly. His concern's my heart. And not necessarily how good it is or how clean it is or how happy it is, but whose is it? Does your heart belong to the Lord? Does your child's heart belong to the Lord? Are you raising your children in such a way that you will be able to just very easily let go of the hand of your child that you've been guiding for years and let him or her grab a hold of the hand of God and walk through life and right off into eternity? That's the question. And folks, it's more important than GPA. It's more important than ERA. It's more important than anything. It's the most important thing of all. See that you walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise, redeeming the time because the days are evil. Paul said that a couple thousand years ago, and it's still true today. We live in an evil time. Therefore, do not be unwise, but understand what the will of the Lord is. Now, just you come up to me and say, "Preacher, I don't know what God's will is." I'm going to tell you, oh, yes, you do. Oh, yes, you do. You may think you have something else in mind, but you truly know the will of God. God's will is that everyone be saved. Now, my will is that everyone be saved. But especially all of you, especially Sharon, especially my boys, especially my girls, especially my grandchildren. I know what the will of God is for you, my friend. If you're here today and you are not absolutely certain about your own salvation, let me tell you, I know what God's will is for you. I know what God's will has been for 2,000 years. I know God's will. It's written in His Word. I know God's will. It's attested to by His disciples. I know God's will. It's right here in black and white. Our invitation hymn today is page 385. And I would ask you today, if you have a decision to make for the Lord, to come forward as we stand and sing. But first, let's pray together. Heavenly Father,